So awareness and memory or knowledge are constructs that are often measured in questionnaires. Awareness is clearly an important marketing objective. We presume that people are not going to buy our products unless people are aware of them. Awareness is fundamentally a belief. It's a belief that links a brand name with a product category. In order to measure it, we have to provide one of those two cues. We can't measure awareness by simply asking people to tell us everything they know and then looking for evidence of awareness of a particular brand. So we either have to ask about the product category or we have to ask about the brand. And that results in awareness measures of different levels of difficulty. For example, we could ask people to name all the brands of digital recorders they know. And if TiVo is mentioned, then we can label that person as brand aware. And if TiVo is not mentioned, then that person will be labeled as brand unaware. We could further identify the place or the position in which TiVo comes up. So if TiVo is the first brand mentioned or the second brand mentioned, those might make a difference. So that's giving them the product category and asking them to provide the brand name. Alternatively, we could give them the brand name, what is TiVo, and see if they know what kind of product it is. Now that's clearly an easier question than the former. And then the easiest question of all is to ask people a sort of yes or no question about familiarity. So check which brands of digital video recorder you're familiar with. Now, the problem with this one is we don't know whether it's true or not. So people can say, yes, I know TiVo, and we don't know whether they're familiar with it. So these three are in decreasing orders of difficulty, and the last one is maybe the least useful. What's important about these measures when there are different degrees of difficulty is that we not end up comparing a simple question with a difficult question. So long as we make comparisons across the same question or the same type of question, we're usually fairly comfortable. Even though it's not necessarily a valid question, at least they're measuring at the same level of specificity. So memory knowledge is a question, an attempt to discover whether people know something other than awareness. It's a more general construct. It's very often applied in day-after recall research. So this is research that's done the day after an advertisement has aired on television or the day after a press release story has gone out. So here's an example. What products do you recall that were advertised on television last night? So again, you're given this general cue and you're asking for specific responses to determine whether people remember the specific response in question. Your commercial, for example. The second example, what brands of laundry detergent were advertised on last night's episode of 30 Rock on NBC? So now you're giving them the specific and asking them, you're giving them a more specific context. You're telling them not only was there an advertisement, but it was an advertisement for laundry detergent. Now, and then the easiest question is recognition. So you're asking whether, sort of again, a yes or no to a specific instance. Indicate the ads in the magazine that you just read that you noticed. An ad for Budweiser, an ad for Ford, an ad for Levi's. And just as with the easiest question for awareness, this type of question is problematic in that you don't know whether people are giving you accurate information. Often the knowledge that a researcher wants to measure is the beliefs about attributes. So the research may take the form of a brand by belief matrix we see here, where the brands, they can be columns or rows, doesn't matter. So we've got 4 brands here, A, B, C, D, and these are brands that compete in a market category. So they're characterized by the same attributes. And so in my case, the attributes are in the column. And the questions would request the respondent to indicate how strongly he believes that brand A has a low price, that brand B has a low price, that brand C has a low price, and so on, for Made in USA and for waterproof. That same kind of information can be measured in the form of an expectancy by asking likelihood questions. So how likely is it that shoes made in the USA are higher quality than shoes made elsewhere? Now, you can think of that as a relative quality attribute, and that you can think of made in the USA as one product category and shoes made in Italy as another category, and so on. So you would end up with the same sort of attribute by brand matrix as above. Alternatively, you can indicate the likelihood that low management fees for mutual funds normally lead to higher than average returns, again using that slider type scale. Now you can use this scale on a paper and pencil measure as well, and just ask people to put a slash for their answer. Now recall from the attitude models, we need to measure both beliefs and affect or importance. So there are standard approaches to measuring these two constructs. Affect is the goodness or badness of a thing. So for example, one might ask for tennis rackets, how good or bad is above average frame flexibility? And here we've got a 7-point good bads or bad good scale. The norm, by the way, is for scales to run from negative to positive, because these attitude models, which are sums of the belief and affect scores, are usually interpreted as higher numbers being more positive attitudes. Second example, when you consider buying a computer, how desirable or undesirable is very high storage capacity above 512 gigs? So we've got, again, a 7-point scale anchored by very undesirable, very desirable. And then third, when you consider candidates for mayor, how much do you like or dislike someone who supports gun control? So this is extreme dislike, extreme like. So you can see 3 adjective pairs here that are synonymous: good, bad, desirable, undesirable, like, dislike. 3 ways of asking essentially the same question. Importance is typically a fairly straightforward measure. When you're buying a car, how important is fuel efficiency? Not at all important to extremely important. And I would say that scale type is fairly standard. Not necessarily a 7-point scale is standard. It could be a 5-point scale or a 10-point scale. The research suggests that the differences between 5, 7, and 10-point scales are fairly small. When you get to 2-point scales or 3-point scales, then you start losing enough precision that it shows up. Just as beliefs are often measured across brands, yielding a brand by belief matrix, same is true for importance weights. Recall that the aim of this is often to construct an attitude, so we need importance weights for each of the attributes and then beliefs for each of the brands. So one might ask the question, think about a decision to buy fresh vegetables. For each of the following considerations, rate its importance to your decision by putting a number in the blank according to the following scale. Not at all important to extremely important. Here it's a 5-point scale. So you're asking people to fill out this attribute importance matrix with 4 attributes here: where it was grown, whether or not it's organic, its appearance, and whether it's packaged or not, and for each one indicate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important that attribute is. I'll talk about a few scale types and options for constructing questions. The first choice is between open or closed-ended or open fixed questions. Open-ended questions should be avoided if one can. They're often necessary simply because the researcher can't anticipate all the possible answers, or there are simply too many possible answers to present a reasonable structured question or fixed end question. But they are difficult to code and difficult to complete. They increase the fatigue if respondents have too many open-ended questions to respond to. If one is going to use open-ended questions, one should attempt to corroborate the responses with fixed-ended questions, and often they work both ways. You can ask a fixed-end question with giving them several choices, and then have sort of a follow-up open-ended question and see whether indeed the fixed-ended question is tapping into what people feel, or alternatively one might discover that something else entirely is being intended by the answer. As I say, they're necessary if the responses, if you don't know what people are going to say, and they're useful if you're looking for fine shades of meaning. So rather than giving people a 7-point scale, you give them an open-ended question and they can elaborate why they kind of like it but kind of don't like it. Fixed scales are much easier to analyze and to code, but one must be careful to assure that they have good content validity, and the best way to do that is to do pretests and talk to people about how they're responding. A second choice is between ranking, rating, and choice. A rank is to ask people to, for example, arrange the brands in order of preference, using one for your most preferred. And this can be done easily with internet questionnaires where you can drag brands around. It can be done on a paper and pencil questionnaire where you ask people to put numbers to indicate their rank. It can be done in a personal interview administration with cards, ask people to rearrange the cards. A second alternative is to ask people to rate each brand on a 1 to 10 scale, and then you as a researcher can construct the ranking. So if there's one brand rated 10 and one brand rated 9, then of course the number 10 brand goes ahead of the number 9 brand. Now, one distinction between the two is ranking can force people to make distinctions. There's only one number 1 brand and one number 2 brand, whereas with rating, people can rate brands the same. On the other hand, rating is a more powerful measure. It's an interval measure and allows one to use more powerful statistics to analyze it. And rating is easier. People can make ratings faster and more comfortably than making rankings. In some situations, however, ranking is a more realistic or isomorphic kind of task. If people are at a grocery store and they're looking at 5 brands of a product, they are essentially mentally ranking them when they make their decision rather than rating each one individually. And then choice is illustrated with the last here. Which of the following brands has the best overall quality? Now clearly that gives you the number 1 brand, but it doesn't tell you anything about the level of that evaluation. You just know it's best. It could be that none of them is really regarded as good. And it doesn't tell you anything about the other brands. So it again is an easy measure, but it has limited information value. Labels and anchors are descriptors that explain or identify scale points. Anchors are those descriptors for the endpoints of the scale. Most commonly, scales have anchors. Sometimes scales have a descriptor for each point. So you see examples below. A 5-point scale of value anchored with very low value, very high value. I apologize for not having the numbers positioned properly there. And then the same scale with each of the 5 points labeled. So very low value, again, the lowest end. But now 2 is labeled fairly low value, and then average value, and then fairly high value. Whether or not you need a descriptor for each point, so whether you need labels in addition to anchors, depends on the clarity and the ease with which participants interpret the scales. And usually you determine this through pretesting. You should also bear in mind that usually these semantic differential scales are presumed to be interval scales, such that the gap between 1 and 2 is identical in size to the gap between 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, so on. So the researcher needs to take care to use labels that describe positions that appear to be equal intervals apart. A related issue to labels and anchors is how many subdivisions in the scale. So number of responses refers to that issue. And there are two aspects of this. One is simply the total number, and that's a question of precision. A 10-point scale allows for finer gradations than a 5-point scale, and thus potentially more precision. Most research indicates that once you get above 5 scale points, the increases in precision tend to fall off. People simply don't see fine enough discriminations to accommodate larger scales, unless they're fairly natural. For example, 100% scale is a fairly natural concept, and dollars and years are fairly straightforward, and people are comfortable making 1% gradations in those scales. The other issue is the odd or even number of responses. So an odd number of responses, 3, 5, 7, and so on, allow respondents to pick the middle. That is, pick a neutral point in the scale. So 3 somehow represents a neutral position on whatever that dimension is on a 5-point scale. Allowing people to choose the neutral point is good if the researcher believes that they legitimately hold neutral positions. It's problematic if people don't feel confident, if they have opinions or they have beliefs, but they don't feel confident in them, and so they choose the neutral position to reflect that lack of confidence. And for that reason, sometimes researchers will use an even number and force people to opt either up or down from the neutral position. Finally, you should recognize that the neutral position on the scale is not the same as no opinion. Although in some cases having no opinion may make one neutral, if there are a significant number of no opinions out there, the researcher should assess those with another option. So one could have a 5-point scale, and then a 6th category would be labeled no opinion. And even though that would be coded as a 6, it would have to be treated differently for analysis purposes, because one wouldn't want that 6 being added in, for example, when calculating the average score. Finally, let me present three specific types of scales. These are the most commonly used. The first is the Likert scale. Likert was a psychologist, and the scale is named after him. Likert scale items are statements with strongly disagree, strongly agree scales. So, for example, the people in my town are extremely friendly, and the respondent is asked to indicate the extent of his agreement with that statement on a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale normally. A semantic differential is a statement about an attribute, and the attribute is anchored with opposite adjectives. So semantic differentials are often called opposite adjective scales. So a researcher could measure the same dimension as with a Likert scale. The people in my town are usually, there should be a blank there, and then the respondent is asked to fill in the blank with some degree of friendliness on a very unfriendly to very friendly scale. The Likert scales and semantic differentials can usually be used to measure the same things. Sometimes one approach is a little simpler than the other. It's hard to characterize when. Sometimes a mix of them is nice because it prevents respondents from getting in a rut. A third type of scale is the constant sum scale. So here the example is divide 100 points among the following business course types, indicating your preference. More points means more preference. So the respondent would have to divide 100 points among marketing, accounting, finance, management, and economics. Now, constant sum is nice in several respects. It, first of all, gives you a measure of preference, just the way rating would. It also gives you a measure of rank order preference, because the more points for an alternative, the higher the preference. Plus, it allows one to infer proportionate differences, because the constant sum scale is a ratio scale. Thus, one would expect here to see maybe 60 points for marketing and 20 points for accounting and the other 20 points dispersed among the other three. And that would allow one to infer not only that marketing was the most preferred major, and not only that it was 30 points better than accounting, but also that it was twice as popular as accounting, because ratio scales allow inferences about proportions.